So today I've been asked to look at the regulatory review of the electricity market in South Africa in the context of the transition to renewable energy sources. And the presentation, obviously, it's to the National Science and Technology Forum, which I am attending. I have the privilege of attending for the very first time. I really enjoyed yesterday's interactions. In terms of the content, I will just have a brief South Africa electricity market overview and talk through really some of the current issues that relate to our energy and regulatory environment that are happening. Just a highlight of the key role players, which I think most people know. Maybe I will highlight the new developments. And then in terms of policy drivers of the energy transition, I would like to look at what are the key policy drivers, starting from when the whole process of the renewable energy started in South Africa. Climate change is obviously one of the critical ones. And I will look at the IRP in terms of where we have been, where we are going, what I think the outlook is, and then a brief overview of the South African renewable energy market, some of the challenges that we are facing currently in advancing that market. The just energy transition, I think we have had a lot of discussion with the previous speaker going into details in terms of the modeling, but I'll just highlight it from a perspective of regulatory and policy issues, as well as from the renewable energy issues that we are facing. And the last bit will be on the conclusion. So the South African electricity market, as everybody probably already knows today, is characterized by a dominance of Eskom, which supplies over 90% of the electricity in the country. And Eskom also owns the transmission infrastructure, and as well as 40% of the distribution infrastructure, 60% of which is owned by municipalities, who are, in terms of the constitutions, the ones that are required to be responsible for reticulation in the country. And that bulk infrastructure that Eskom sends to electricity goes to consumers, customers from industrial, mining, commercial, residential, and agriculture, as well as other consumers. We have had an introduction on the generation side of independent power producers. However, the independent power producers, there isn't really a market where there's competition in the market yet. There is a proposed transformation of or unbundling of the market to allow the IPPs to be able to compete with Eskom. Because currently Eskom plays the role of supplying generation and plays the role also of reviewing applications from the independent power producers for their power purchase agreement. So they really have access to information that relates to competition, which is not ideal if you're trying to open up a market. The playing field should be level. This is why the Department of Public Enterprises is looking at separating the transmission company into a national transmission company, which will be responsible for buying of the power. It will be responsible for still maintaining the transmission infrastructure, for owning it. It will be responsible for system operation to make sure that supply and demand in South Africa continues to be stable. So it will have that role, and the legislation that is currently being amended is the Electricity Regulation Act, which aims to unbundle this transmission division. We have also imports that come from the region. Cahora Bassa in Mozambique is one of the big exporters of electricity, which is hydropower-based electricity from the region. We have constraints, of course, with respect to Eskom supply that is based on coal generation, and that the market is not necessarily, does not have an appetite for new generation capacity from coal. And so South Africa is at a crossroads of trying to see whether there's a continuation with respect to the coal-fired power plants, or there's a transition into renewable energy sources of electricity. Eskom also exports power to the Southern African power pool, where there's a market, day-ahead market of trading of electricity. It exports to countries like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and so on and so on. Right, not moving. Okay. In terms of the key role players in the market, this is just to provide an overview, but I think most people would be familiar with that. Obviously, there tends to be confusing sometimes with some of the players that are not involved in the sector when it comes to the Department of Public Enterprises role, the Department of Minerals and Energy's role, and the recent new Minister of Electricity, whose real responsibility is to look at current load shedding that we are facing. So Eskom basically reports to the Department of Public Enterprises. The Department of Public Enterprises, as a 100% shareholder of Eskom, is the one that looks at Eskom's performance, that reviews, sets the goals for the Eskom board in terms of where they're supposed to be. In the past, there has been criticism that the DPE hasn't really been doing their work properly when it comes to some of the board members. There was a time when almost 7 of the board members were vacancies. There were vacancies for board members, which then impacted on Eskom's governance issues. But as we all know, there's a new board that has joined Eskom that has set new targets for turning around the institution, which have suffered a lot from a governance point of view, details of which I think everyone knows from the Zondo Commission. The Department of Minerals and Energy's role is really to ensure that there's a policy certainty in the market that includes that policy impacts on Eskom, obviously. And one of the critical legislation that is coming through right now relating to Eskom is on the electricity Act, which is being amended, I referred to earlier on, and that will talk to how the transition from the current Eskom vertically integrated utility to a utility that is broken down into the transmission division, that will hopefully open up the market to multiple players on the generation side, including the existing municipalities, including the existing IPPs, as well as some of the distributed generation from IPPs. The National Treasury is one of the critical players in the market. As you would all know, it's out there that Eskom is struggling with respect to its balance sheet in the market, and National Treasury has had to come through to assist Eskom with that, with the debt, so that Eskom is able to do work on its power stations, to do work on maintenance, which has been a problem in the past. This is an ongoing issue that National Treasury is trying to balance by taking over some of the debt that Eskom has, so that Eskom can focus on operational matters and optimize their supply. We know one of the critical challenges that Eskom is facing now with the electricity supply constraints is that they are spending a lot of money on diesel, and this is what is keeping National Treasury worried. Another impact that National Treasury is providing guarantees for the independent power producers that are buying power from Eskom in the event that Eskom is unable to pay. However, that has an impact on South Africa in general in terms of the fiscus, as, for instance, water boards. If they were to try and do projects in the sector, Eskom is bogged down by guarantees that are heavy on the fiscus in South Africa. So this is one of the policy dilemmas as we transition that needs government to pay attention to say, in the future, are we seeing the current model continuing, or are we seeing new players that come from the private sector, which have the balance sheets to be able to develop projects, to be able to put in the infrastructure that is required without requiring balance sheet from a national treasury? So it's one of the policy dilemmas or questions, if you like, that South Africa is facing with respect to sustainability of this market and this transition into the future. The Department of Environment, Forestry, and Fisheries and Forestry is responsible, obviously, for environmental policy and ensuring that Eskom complies with this policy. One of the critical issues that is facing South Africa, and Eskom in particular with respect to this issue, is the localized pollution, which in many instances Eskom has exceeded the limits, and they have been wrapped around the knuckles by the department to say that they need to put in infrastructure to retrofit these plants to ensure that the localized pollution is controlled. So this is one of the issues that is plaguing Eskom in terms of going forward with the current plants. Does Eskom decommission the plants to ensure that they don't spend much on retrofitting, or does Eskom continue with, as the Minister of Electricity has been suggesting, with the plants and then put in this infrastructure to retrofit? So those are some of the policy questions and dilemmas that are within the environmental sphere in South Africa. The other key question relates to, obviously, the climate change commitments that South Africa has made to reduce emissions which impact on climate change, and in future, where South Africa is likely to go with this issue is a question. And then the other critical role player in the market is NERSA, which is the National Electricity Regulator, which regulates the electricity market in South Africa in general. And the legislation that set them up was the Electricity Regulator Act that formed NERSA and determined what their responsibilities are. So the key questions that really sometimes have plagued NERSA in the market have related to the tariff setting and the key role players in the market that have different or conflicting objectives. Some are looking for tariffs that are sustainable, especially industry and residential customers that are sustainable in the future, so that they can help support South Africa in terms of growing the market. So this is a key challenge that pressure has been on NERSA on this issue. In particular, you will recall that at some point NERSA made a decision not to grant Eskom funds that were coming from National Treasury that were regarded as equity, and decided not to grant them, and Eskom took them to court and won in that regard. So it still becomes a difficult balancing act, as Eskom requires a sustainable tariff to be able to continue as they are and to do operations and to have the funds that they require. But consumers, on the other hand, require a sustainable, and industry requires a sustainable tariff so that South Africa can advance its economic objectives. The National Nuclear Regulator regulates, obviously, we have the only RUBK nuclear power plant that's based in the Western Cape in South Africa. So the National Nuclear Regulator takes control in terms of the related safety measures with respect to RUBK. We know that the nuclear sector is one of the most regulated industries in the market. Municipalities, in terms of the constitution, have the responsibility for reticulation. However, we know that Eskom still has some of the distribution infrastructure residing within Eskom, about 40% of that market. And then the independent power producers I referred to earlier on have entered the market. We have almost 7,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity that comes from independent power producers, which are the large-scale developers and suppliers of electricity from renewable energy projects. And then we have end users, which I referred to earlier on. In terms of the new minister, I alluded to the minister coming into the market. In the beginning, there was confusion with respect to what the minister's role was, because we have the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. However, the minister's role has been clarified as one that looks at specifically the electricity supply crisis plan that the president announced that seeks to mitigate the impact that load shedding is having on users and consumers in South Africa. And we've seen the minister giving updates every now and again on where the system is and how we are doing with respect to managing this. Of course, that should not be confused with the role of the Department of Public Enterprises in managing Eskom. So the transition that we're talking about, what the key drivers in terms from a policy and regulatory point of view, that initially kickstarted, if you like, the market was the white paper on energy policy, which really had 5 critical objectives: to increase access to affordable energy services, and to improve energy governance, to stimulate economic development, and to manage energy-related environmental impacts, and to secure electricity supply through diversity. Now, what often people talk about in the market with respect to these critical objectives or the vision for the energy sector that has been stated in the white paper has been to what extent, what are the sources of electricity that would be able to address these requirements. You will see that there's environmental impacts, which renewable energy are one of the technologies that are looking to address that. However, there are security of supply constraints when it comes to variability of that technology. Therefore, this policy called for diversity of different technologies to allow for sustainability, to ensure that the market, the system is always in balance and we don't experience a challenge of a system collapse. So this is why this is what had been envisaged in the white paper. The white paper also looked at at that very early stage in 1998, envisaged a market development where there would be a breakdown of the electricity market, which is something that we are starting to see happen, but still have a long way to go. The renewable energy white paper also was one of the key foundations for promoting of renewable energy in South Africa, at that time set a 10-year target to diversify energy mix, including renewable energy in the system. And it was a slow start, really, because this was envisaged to happen in 2013, but we only promulgated the Integrated Resource Plan in 2011, which kickstarted, really, in essence, the renewable energy market in the country. The aim was then to secure cleaner sources of energy from renewable sources, driven by concerns around global warming. Another piece of legislation that is a driver of the transition is the National Climate Resource Response Policy White Paper, which was also in 2021. It envisaged that South Africa would peak and plateau and decline in terms of its strategy on greenhouse gases. South Africa submitted nationally determined contributions under the climate change, committing to limit emissions. I think these numbers may have changed, but there may have been more ambitious limits in terms of emissions. This is why then the renewable energy sector plays a role in the market in South Africa today. One of the long-term energy planning strategies that was introduced in the market is the Integrated Resource Plan. The main aim of the plan was to really diversify the South African energy mix. But the biggest change, or the biggest change was renewable energy, which would be increased in terms of its role in the future energy mix. At the time, it was envisaged that the decommissioning of coal-fired power plants would take place, and then gas, the open cycle gas turbines that we have in the coastal area in South Africa would be retrofitted to use gas. However, I think most would know that we haven't really built an infrastructure for gas in South Africa currently. We have the gas that comes from Mozambique, goes through to Sasol, but that is nowhere near where the open cycle gas turbines are, and they are running out of gas that comes from Mozambique. In future, that gas is going to run out. So South Africa really has to articulate a proper strategy with respect to the introduction of gas in South Africa. What infrastructure is what is the plan with respect to the infrastructure that will facilitate for this to happen? What is the plan with respect to the gas resources? Of course, we have the resources that have been discovered in the coastal areas in the Western Cape, and that has been facing challenges as due to opposition to fossil fuels by environmentalists. And we also have the potential resources in the Karoo, where fracking was envisaged, but that has also been a moratorium was put on that, which we hear in now that it's envisaged that may be lifted. We know that this type of gas has been a game changer for countries like America, where they really introduced shale gas, and they've since reduced significantly their dependence on imports from the Middle East, which were generally would typically be a source of conflict. So South Africa is also still battling with, on the policy side, regulatory side, what is our really plan with respect to introduction of gas in South Africa. We had envisaged, again, a capacity from INGA, the DRC. I think the problem with the long-term energy planning in South Africa sometimes is that, yes, it's long-term, so it should envisage long-term projects, but we tend to be very much supply-side driven we tend to look at it also from the demand side and not look at what the constraints are in the proposed, call it technologies, proposed solutions that we put on the table. For instance, if you look at the INGA project, the DRC, that project has not materialized in many years. I think when I started working in the electricity sector, it was in 1998, and we had been talking about INGA producing electricity and bringing it to South Africa. At the time, INGA had a huge potential off-taker that was a mining giant that could have made the project feasible. But there are many, call it political, the project would go through a number of countries from the DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe, through to South Africa. That means there's a huge requirement to build expansive infrastructure in terms of transmission infrastructure, besides the actual development of the actual project itself. In the recent past, the president mentioned this project, but not much in terms of details was mentioned. But just on the energy planning side and the transition and the different options that we have and we look at, we tend to not stress test some of these assumptions that we have. Another option was the nuclear with RUBK extension of the life that is ongoing right now. We know that there's been a bit of a delay with the Unit 1 at RUBK. When Eskom has recently announced that from November, I think the 3rd of November, they expect that unit to be back and for Unit 2 to go on another life extension project. RUBK has been in operation since 1984 for Unit 1 and 1985 for Unit 2. So it's reached the end of its life, and there is a proposed extension from that 40 years to another 20 years, which would basically be 60 years. Some of the advantages of the nuclear technology with respect to emissions is that you get zero emissions from that, and you get base load capacity, which is stable. And it is one of the plants that currently is showing from an operational point of view to be very cost effective. But there have been concerns and questions regarding any new capacity, any new nuclear capacity, whether that would be affordable or not. I think it's difficult for people to talk about that without looking at a feasibility, really. But there are new developments around the world that are happening around that. Distributed generation is from mainly some of these end users that are facing constraints with respect to the tariff that Eskom is charging, as well as trying to diversify their sources of energy to renewable energy, mainly because of the concerns with relying on a supply that is predominantly from coal sources. So you find that some of the industrial users are trying to diversify. But the reality is that Eskom is the anchor in terms of how much capacity they just have. And introducing the renewable energy is a diversification, but cannot replace the capacity that Eskom provides. We have mentioned plant performance challenges that Eskom is facing, and the board setting up a target to increase the energy availability factor within those plants. The envisaged increase would be from 60% to 70% in 2 years. And we have seen some progress from energy availability factors in those plants moving from 48% to the current 60%. So there is progress, but we have to be cautious because it takes a while to turn around the challenges that Eskom is facing. In terms of the outlook, we know that the Kusile unit 3 units within Kusile and are expected to come back online in the next at the end of this year. The Minister of Electricity also mentioned that one of the plants that have been having problems in Eskom Tutuka, about 1,500 megawatts will be available. So there is some reprieve that seems will come on stream. Medupi Unit 4, which had also experienced a challenge with the fire and explosion there, is expected to come on stream also at end of this year. So if all of that materializes, significant capacity within the Eskom network will come back on stream. We know that in respect to the IRP, that it's supposed to be a document that is regularly updated. However, that has not been feasible in the past, but the Minister of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy has announced that the IRP 2023, which will be an update from the one that I'm talking about, will be presented to Cabinet next week. So we're looking forward to understanding what that mix will look like. But in one of the engagements, recent engagements, the minister has mentioned that renewable energy will obviously continue to play a huge role in the mix, but they will also be an increase for nuclear. Coal will continue to be part of the procurement. We don't know whether those projects will be feasible, because if you look at this IRP 2019, we have struggled to turn around 2 of the projects that were coal-based projects based on financing that is drying up in this regard. So there is a policy question that needs to be addressed or looked at with respect to what is the way forward regarding coal if government decides that that is the policy in terms of its financing and its feasibility. The South African renewable energy market has since started with the promulgation of the Integrated Resource Plan in March 2021. And since then, there have been significant inroads, although there have been challenges with this Eskom at some point stopping the process of signing power purchase agreement with independent power producers, citing the costs of the technologies as well as the variability of the technology. But that process was addressed, and we have a total capacity of over, I think it's almost 7,000 megawatts today of electricity that come from renewable energy sources. There are questions, however, related to the future of the procurement process, which I alluded to earlier on, with respect to its impact on the fiscus, as well as there is a growing market, in any case, from the private sector that is developing projects to supply their own capacity. And these projects do not really require support from government. And so there is a question with respect to what does the future look like with respect to these bid window projects where government procures from IPPs and signs a power purchase agreement, which is backed up by government. It's one of the reasons why we have a successful renewable energy market in South Africa, the backing up by National Treasury or through guarantees. What are some of the challenges that we are facing the renewable energy market in terms of this envisaged transition? Some of the key challenges, we know that there was an emergency procurement that was expected between 2019 and 2022. This was a technology agnostic process, which ended up including the car power ship which South Africa is looking to procure as an emergency unit to plug up the gap that we have between our electricity supply as well as the demand. However, some of these projects have reached financial close and have reached signed agreements, started construction, but not all of the projects have done that. We have also distributed from a bid window 5, for instance, the preferred bidders were also announced in 2021, but there have been challenges because some of the prices that were quoted by the bidders were not sustainable. And so the bidders had to go back to the drawing board. But the question that is a policy and regulatory issue is whether or not, when you have a bid process that is announced that everyone plays by, do you have the opportunity or the right even to change the conditions which other bidder, would that be fair to other bidders that had bidded on the process? So that is the question that is out there in the market, people are discussing. So from a transition of the renewable energy projects, these are some of the challenges that the market is facing to be able to advance more renewable energy projects. The bid window 6, for instance, had an initial 2,600 megawatts, which was doubled to 5,200 megawatts. But there were transmission constraints, which for a lot of projects that spend time and effort and resources developing, especially the wind projects around the Western Cape, could not access grid capacity, as some of the projects that are coming out from the project sector that are not the part of the procurement program started applying for this the transmission infrastructure and holding some of this infrastructure without being ready to connect the projects. This posed a problem for Eskom, and as a result, from a regulatory point of view, there is now a reconsideration of the rules in that market. What rules do we have? We know that one of the independent power producers went to court to challenge government with respect to exactly this issue of Eskom stopping that process of the criteria of accessing the grid. So they still that process is still pending in terms of the court, but Eskom has I think they've published the rules in terms of the market. Some are calling them onerous, so that if that is the case, that could pose a challenge to the continuing or the pace of the development of these renewable energy projects in the market. So although we have in South Africa some of the best resources in the Northern Cape, for instance, for solar resources, we have in the coastal areas like the Eastern Cape and Northern Cape, we have grid constraints in those areas. So the projects are now forced to look at other areas where the grid may be available, areas like Mpumalanga, areas like Limpopo, where there's still some capacity. But from a profitability point of view, obviously, when you reduce the resource that you get from the project, the revenues that you will enjoy will not be the same as when you have access to the highest resource in the market. But they are still feasible because if you look at countries like Germany, I mean, our lowest areas in terms of resources that we have in the country still do not match. So there is that constraint, but there are also some mitigating issues. But the biggest constraint is access to the grid. And this is not only confined to South Africa. This is something that other countries are facing as well. In Europe, with respect to queues that take up to something like 2 years in some instances, and also issues like permitting. South Africa, we know, has now recently also opened up a one-stop shop in order to enable the regulatory or the permitting and the license, permitting that is required from the various departments to be held in one department, which is the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, which will facilitate for a quicker process. We know also that the Department of Environment had also announced that in terms of solar PV projects, for instance, that they would shorten the process, particularly for those projects that will be built in areas which are not there are no sensitivities to environment, which that is determined by a competent environmental person, that they would expedite that. But without the grid constraints, really, all of those potential positive could be a challenge. And so Eskom has to develop a huge amount of transmission infrastructure. Municipalities also have to strengthen their distribution grids for projects connecting in those areas. So this is a big area because then it impacts on the financials of these institutions, and it poses a threat to the renewable energy market growing in the future in the way expected. Of course, there will still be growth in the market, but in terms of these constraints, the outlook is constrained.
Ms. Moleshe, how many slides have you got still?
I've got 2 more, I think. Am I running out of time?
Yes, you're way over time.
Oh my goodness. Okay, let me just wrap up then.
Thank you.
So the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan has was envisaged to look at investments in infrastructure, in what was envisaged to be decommissioning of the coal fire plants, dealing with the distribution and transmission infrastructure issues that I spoke about, as well as investment in renewable energy. But the key policy questions is that is South Africa ready to decommission coal? We heard the Minister of Electricity saying something different to that. What is the plan to deal with the associated security of supply challenges if we decommission? What is the plan to tackle the systematic challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment that would result from the just energy transition? In summary, let me summarize. In summary, I think that we have South Africa is obviously, the question was with relate to policy and regulatory, is on the right track in terms of attracting investments from renewable energy projects. But there are a number of policy dilemmas and challenges related to the grid, related to Eskom's sustainability, related to policy confusion when it comes to whether South Africa is planning to decommission or whether South Africa is not. And also with respect to renewable energy capacity transition without other flexible technologies that will provide security of supply is also a constraint. Thank you very much.